Right now, somewhere in the world, there's someone who grew up in the 1960s sitting in a quiet room, scrolling through a younger generation's life, and quietly thinking, they don't understand how we were built. And that's not judgment, that's just observation. Because the psychology of people raised in the 1960s is not just nostalgia-fueled toughness. It's a specific way the mind was shaped by the world they woke up in every day. If you're watching this, and you were born in the 1960s, or your parents were, stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand not just where that mindset came from, but why it shows up in the way you react, the way you handle stress, and the way you view the world today. And no, this isn't about glorifying the past. It's about understanding the patterns that still live inside you. Let me be honest with you. The 1960s weren't just another decade. They were a psychological pressure cooker. Wars, riots, protests, rapid social change, and economic uncertainty. Kids born in that era didn't grow up in a world that promised them comfort. They grew up inside a world that said, deal with it. And that changes how the brain wires itself. Most people don't realize that the way they tolerate discomfort, the way they handle authority, the way they view work and relationships, is shaped less by their personality and more by the invisible psychological architecture built in childhood. So today, I'm going to walk you through the core psychological traits of people who grew up in the 1960s. Why they think and feel the way they do, and how that mindset shows up in everyday life. And trust me, the last one will change how you see your parents, your elders, and maybe even yourself. But before we get into the traits, understand this. The human brain is lazy when it comes to threat. It doesn't like to question what's already wired. If you grew up in an environment where discomfort, uncertainty, and limited attention were normal, your brain simply learned to adapt to that. That's not a flaw, that's survival. So let's start with the first major psychological pattern. Body part number 1, in this metaphor, is the relationship with discomfort. Let's start with something most people overlook completely: the way this generation was taught to suffer in silence. When you grew up in the 1960s, you didn't have 1,000 apps to distract you from boredom. You didn't have constant entertainment. You didn't have someone asking you every 5 minutes how you felt. You had chores, long lines, uneventful afternoons, and the expectation that you could sit with it. From a psychological perspective, that taught something called distress tolerance. The ability to feel uncomfortable, bored, or frustrated without needing to escape it immediately. Modern therapy talks about this like it's a skill you have to learn. For this generation, it was just life. Here's where it goes deeper. When you normalize discomfort, your brain learns that emotion is not an emergency. If you're raised in a culture that says don't cry, shake it off, toughen up, your nervous system doesn't reinterpret stress as a crisis. It learns to endure it. That's why so many people from the 1960s can sit through conflict, loss, or uncertainty without dramatic breakdowns. It's not because they don't feel it. It's because they were never given permission to treat it like a catastrophe. Now, here's what most outsiders miss. That same resilience that helps them through crisis can also make them emotionally distant when warmth is needed. Because they were never taught to label or express feelings, they learned to suppress them. And suppression looks a lot like strength until it shows up as numbness, stubbornness, or quiet resentment. So the first psychological signature is clear. Higher distress tolerance coupled with lower emotional expression. They can handle a lot, but they don't always know how to talk about it. Body part number 2 is the relationship with authority and control. The 1960s were a time of massive social upheaval. Civil rights movements, anti-war protests, counterculture, and a general distrust of institutions. Kids born in that era didn't grow up in a world where authority was unquestioned. They grew up watching their parents argue with the government, march in the streets, and question the rules. Psychologically, that builds something called an internal locus of control. The belief that your life is shaped more by your choices and effort than by pure luck or fate. In the 1960s, the message was often, if you want things to change, you have to get off your couch and do something. That's powerful. Here's what that looks like in practice. People raised in the 60s are more likely to say things like, if you want it, you have to work for it. They're more likely to blame themselves when something fails, because they were taught that effort controls outcomes. On the surface, that sounds healthy. Responsibility, discipline, accountability. But it has a dark side. When you only believe in effort and hard work, you start to see people who struggle as not trying hard enough. You lose empathy for systemic barriers, mental health issues, and invisible wounds. And emotionally, that manifests as impatience with vulnerability, frustration with complaining, and a quiet belief that people who need help should just toughen up. Quick check for you. Ask yourself, do you ever feel guilty when you ask for help, or frustrated when someone seems too sensitive? If the answer is yes, you might be carrying a 1960s-style mindset, even if you weren't born in that decade. Body part number 3 is the psychology of independence and self-reliance. Let's talk about latchkey kids. In the 1960s and 70s, it was normal for children to walk home alone, make their own snacks, and solve their own problems without constant adult supervision. Parents worked, and kids were expected to entertain themselves. From a psychological standpoint, that builds self-efficacy, the belief that you can handle things on your own. You don't need someone to micromanage your life. You learn how to fix things, how to negotiate conflicts with other kids, how to make decisions without being told what to do. Here's the thing about self-efficacy. It creates strong, capable adults who can function under pressure. But it also creates adults who feel uncomfortable asking for help because they were never supposed to need it. Their identity is built on, I can do this myself. So when life gets hard, their first move is to isolate, to push through, to quietly carry the weight. And psychologically, that's a double-edged sword. On one hand, they're incredibly resilient. On the other hand, they're emotionally alone. They were taught to be independent, but not to be emotionally intimate. Body part number 4 is the attitude toward boredom and play. The 1960s didn't give kids constant entertainment. There was no TikTok, no endless YouTube, no 24-hour cartoons. Kids played outside, climbed trees, got scraped, and accepted that, after a while, they were just bored. Psychologically, that taught boredom tolerance and self-entertainment. When you can't escape boredom with a screen, you either learn to create your own fun or you learn to sit with it. And both build creativity and mental flexibility. Now, here's the modern contrast. Many younger people grow up with attention always being fed. The moment they feel bored, they reach for a device. That trains the brain to panic when attention isn't constantly stimulated. The 1960s brain, on the other hand, learned to self-regulate, to find interest in simple things, and to accept that life contains stretches of nothing happening. That's why many people from that generation can sit quietly, read, garden, or work without feeling the need to be constantly entertained. They're not boring people, they're people who never learned to fear silence. Body part number 5 is the emotional wiring around scarcity and enough. The 1960s were not a decade of endless abundance. Many families lived with limited resources. You didn't always get the newest toy, the fanciest car, or the trendiest clothes. You learned to make do with what you had. Psychologically, that builds something called contentment with enough. When you're used to having less, you stop equating happiness with more. You appreciate small comforts more deeply. You don't need constant upgrades to feel satisfied. On the surface, that sounds like a beautiful trait. And it is. But it can also show up as emotional frugality. People who were raised in scarcity often struggle to give or receive emotional abundance. They're used to rationing, not overflowing. They're cautious with praise, careful with affection, and hesitant to admit when they're hurting. Now, let's connect the dots. When you combine high distress tolerance, strong internal locus of control, extreme self-reliance, boredom tolerance, and scarcity-based contentment, you get a psychological profile that looks something like this. Emotionally under-expressive but highly resilient. Disciplined but emotionally guarded. Independent but relationally distant. Realistic about life's hardships but pessimistic about emotional safety. And here's where the Stoic lens fits in. Stoicism teaches that we don't control what happens to us, but we can control how we respond. That idea lives naturally in the 1960s raised mind. They don't expect life to be kind. They expect it to be hard. And they expect themselves to handle it. But here's the problem most people don't talk about. When you grow up expecting hardship, you start to treat softness as a threat. Vulnerability feels dangerous. Asking for help feels like failure. Emotional openness feels like weakness. And that's why so many people from this generation struggle to connect deeply in relationships, even when they're loyal and dependable. So, how do you respond if you're dealing with someone who grew up in the 1960s? Or if that's you, this part matters. Noticing these psychological patterns doesn't mean you change them overnight. It means you see them clearly. You realize that the person isn't cold because they don't care. They're just wired to protect themselves. If that's your parent, your partner, or your older friend, the best move is simple. Create safety first. Speak calmly. Don't force them to talk. Don't shame them for being emotionally unavailable. Let them reveal themselves at their own pace. If that's you, if you grew up in the 1960s and recognize these patterns, practice this. Observe your instinct before you act on it. When you feel the urge to push through pain, pause and ask, do I need to handle this alone? Or could I let someone in? Attraction doesn't live in perfect words. Emotional connection doesn't live in dramatic confessions. It lives in presence, in the willingness to be seen, in the courage to admit